I remember it like it was yesterday, even though it happened years ago. I was camping alone in the deep woods of northern Canada, surrounded by nothing but trees and wildlife. It was a peaceful place, and I was looking forward to a few days of solitude and reflection. But on the second night of my stay, something strange happened. I was sitting by the fire, reading a book, when I heard a strange sound coming from the woods. It was a low growling noise, like an animal in distress. I couldn't see anything in the darkness, but the sound seemed to be getting closer. I stood up, cautiously, and walked towards the edge of the campsite, trying to see what was making the noise. And that's when I saw it, or rather, saw something that I can only describe as a creature from hell. It was standing just beyond the light of my campfire, and it was tall and thin, with matted hair and glowing eyes. Its skin was stretched tight over its bones, like it was starving, and it had long, razor-sharp claws that glinted in the firelight. I froze, unable to move, as it took a step closer to me. That's when I realized what I was looking at, a Wendigo. I'd heard the legends before, but I'd never believed in them until that moment. I tried to back away, but my feet wouldn't move, and the creature kept coming closer. And then, just when I thought it was going to attack me, something strange happened. The Wendigo seemed to dissolve, like it was made of mist, and it vanished into the darkness. I was left standing there, alone in the woods, shaken and terrified. I packed up my campsite that night and left the woods as quickly as I could. I didn't sleep for days, haunted by the memory of what I'd seen. And even now, years later, I can still remember the sound of that creature's growl, and the way its eyes seemed to glow in the darkness. I don't know what I saw that night, but I know it wasn't human. And I'll never forget the fear I felt in that moment, when I came face to face with the stuff of nightmares. I have a story to share with you all that happened to me a few years ago. It's a story about a skinwalker or a Wendigo sighting, I'm not sure which one it was. I was camping with a few friends in the woods of northern Michigan when it happened. We had set up our tents near a small lake and were enjoying our time in nature. We had a campfire going and were roasting marshmallows when we heard a strange noise coming from the woods. It sounded like something was moving around, but we couldn't see anything. At first, we didn't pay much attention to it, thinking it might just be a raccoon or a squirrel. But the noise continued, and it was getting closer. We all started to feel uneasy, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. That's when we saw it. It was a figure standing in the tree line, just beyond the reach of the campfire's light. It was tall and thin, with long arms and legs that seemed to be too thin for its body. It had pale, almost translucent skin and eyes that glowed in the dark. We couldn't make out its face, but we knew it wasn't human. We all froze, not knowing what to do. It didn't move, just stood there watching us. We tried to convince ourselves that it was just a trick of the light, but deep down, we knew it wasn't. Suddenly, it let out a blood-curdling scream that sent chills down our spines. It was a sound unlike anything we had ever heard before. We scrambled to grab our things and get out of there as fast as we could. As we ran, we heard the sound of twigs snapping and leaves rustling behind us. We didn't dare look back, afraid of what we might see. When we finally reached our car, we jumped in and locked the doors. We drove away as fast as we could, not stopping until we were far away from the woods. We never spoke about what happened that night again, but we all knew that we had seen something that wasn't human. We later found out about skinwalkers and wendigos, and we're convinced that what we saw was one of them. I still get chills thinking about that night. I don't think I'll ever go camping in the woods again. I never believed in the supernatural until I saw it with my own eyes. It was a late summer evening, and I was driving home from a friend's house. I took a shortcut through the woods to save time, but I wish I had just taken the long way home. As I drove deeper into the forest, the air grew colder, and a sense of dread overcame me. It was as if something was watching me from the darkness, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I tried to shake the feeling, but it persisted, growing stronger with each passing minute. That's when I saw it, standing in the middle of the road. At first, I thought it was a deer, but as I got closer, I realized it was something else entirely. It had the body of a man, but its face was twisted and deformed, with sharp teeth and glowing eyes. I slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. The creature leapt onto my hood, leaving a massive dent. Its hands, which were now claws, dug into the metal, and it began to scrape its way towards me. I tried to scream, but my voice was caught in my throat. I knew I had to get out of there, but my hands were shaking so badly that I couldn't find the door handle. That's when I heard a voice whisper in my ear, "Don't look into its eyes. It will take you." I turned my head and saw an old woman standing beside my car. She had a stern look on her face and a necklace made of bones around her neck. "Get out of here, child," she said. "Before it's too late." I didn't need to be told twice. I found the door handle and stumbled out of the car. The creature let out a blood-curdling scream and lunged at me, but the old woman threw something at it. It hit the creature's head, and it stumbled backward, giving me enough time to run. I sprinted through the woods, not daring to look back. I could hear the creature chasing me, its claws scraping against the trees. I thought I was going to die, but then I saw the old woman's cabin in the distance. I burst through the door, and the old woman slammed it shut behind me. The creature pounded on the door, but it couldn't get in. The old woman turned to me, and her eyes were filled with a mix of fear and anger. "You're lucky to be alive," she said. "That was a skinwalker. They're dangerous creatures that can take on the form of any animal or person. You must never look into their eyes, or they'll take your soul." I never forgot that night, and I never drove through the woods alone again. Even now, years later, I still have nightmares about that creature and the old woman who saved my life. I know that I'll never forget what I saw that night, and I'll always believe in the supernatural. I'm not one to easily believe in supernatural beings or urban legends. But after what I experienced last summer, I can't deny that there are things out there that can't be explained. It was a camping trip with my friends in the deep woods of northern Michigan. We had been looking forward to it for months, planning every detail to make it a perfect getaway. But things took a turn for the worse on the second night. We had just finished dinner and were gathered around the fire, chatting and enjoying the peace and quiet of nature. Suddenly, we heard a strange noise coming from the woods. It sounded like a mix of howling and growling, something not quite animal, but not quite human either. At first, we thought it might be a bear or a pack of wolves, so we grabbed our flashlights and scanned the perimeter of the campsite. But what we saw was far more terrifying. There, just beyond the trees, was a figure that stood almost 7 feet tall. Its body was emaciated and its skin was stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes were glowing a bright red, and its teeth were sharp and jagged. As we watched in disbelief, the figure began to move towards us, its movements unnatural and jerky. It seemed to be almost gliding across the forest floor, not quite touching the ground. We all froze, unsure of what to do. Then, as if by instinct, we grabbed our camping gear and ran towards our cars. We could hear the figure following us, its growling getting louder and more aggressive. We made it to the cars and quickly piled in, locking the doors behind us. We sat there in silence for what felt like hours, too scared to move or even breathe. Eventually, we worked up the courage to turn on the headlights and peer into the darkness. There, just beyond the trees, we saw it again. The figure was standing still, watching us with its glowing eyes. We could feel its gaze on us, even from that distance. We drove out of there as fast as we could, not stopping until we reached the nearest town. We told the police what we saw, but they didn't seem to believe us. They chalked it up to a bear or some other wild animal. But I know what I saw that night, and it wasn't any ordinary creature. It was a skinwalker, or perhaps even a wendigo, come to terrorize us in the deep woods. And I'll never forget the feeling of pure terror that it instilled in me that night. I've always been a fan of hiking and exploring the outdoors. But after the experience I had, I'm not sure I'll ever step foot in the woods again. It happened last summer, and I still have nightmares about it. I was camping alone in the woods, about a 2-hour hike away from the nearest town. It was peaceful, and I loved being surrounded by nature. However, on the third night, everything changed. I heard strange noises outside my tent. At first, I thought it was just an animal, but then I heard footsteps circling my tent. They were heavy and sounded like they belonged to a man. I froze, not knowing what to do. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but I knew deep down that it wasn't. The footsteps eventually stopped, and I heard a low growl. It sounded inhuman, and my heart was pounding in my chest. Suddenly, the growling turned into a high-pitched screech, and I could feel the ground vibrating under me. I knew I had to get out of there. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent as quietly as possible. As soon as I stepped out, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Standing in front of me was a creature that I can only describe as a skinwalker or wendigo. Its eyes were glowing red, and its skin was stretched tight over its bones. It was tall and emaciated, and it looked like it had been starving for years. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. I was frozen in fear, and the creature started to move towards me. It was slow, but its steps were deliberate. I could hear its bones creaking as it moved. I don't know how I managed to get away, but I ran as fast as I could. I could hear the creature behind me, but I didn't dare look back. I eventually made it to my car and drove straight to the nearest town. I didn't stop until I was in a hotel room with the doors locked and all the lights on. I don't know if what I saw was a skinwalker or a wendigo, but I know it was real. I still have nightmares about it, and I don't think I'll ever be able to go camping again. Whatever it wasn't human, and I hope I never have to encounter it again. I was driving down a deserted road in the middle of the night when I saw something in my headlights. At first, I thought it was just a deer, but as I got closer, I realized it was something much more sinister. It was a creature with matted fur and sunken eyes. Its limbs were unnaturally long and twisted, and its face was distorted into a grotesque snarl. I slammed on the brakes, and the creature lunged at the car, clawing at the windows and trying to break in. I was frozen with fear, but I managed to slam the car into reverse and peel out of there. I didn't look back until I was miles away, and by then, the creature was gone. I later learned that the creature I saw was a skinwalker, a witch who can transform into any animal they desire. They are known for their malevolent intentions and their ability to bring harm to those who cross their paths. I've never been one to believe in the supernatural, but that experience changed me. I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched, that the skinwalker is still out there, waiting for its next victim. I may have lived to tell the tale, but I'll never forget the terror that gripped me that night. And I'll never be able to shake the feeling that the skinwalker is still out there, waiting to strike again. I have a story that still gives me chills to this day. It happened a few years ago when I was camping alone in the deep woods of Michigan. I've always loved the great outdoors and the feeling of being alone in nature, so I didn't think twice about taking this trip solo. I set up camp near a lake and spent the first few days fishing and exploring the nearby trails. But on the fourth night, something strange happened. I was sitting by my campfire when I heard a rustling sound in the bushes nearby. At first, I assumed it was just a small animal, but then I heard a low growling noise. I stood up and grabbed my flashlight, shining it towards the bushes. That's when I saw it, a large creature with matted fur and glowing red eyes. Its limbs were twisted and bent in unnatural ways, and it had long, sharp claws. I was frozen in fear as it stepped out of the bushes and started to approach me. I knew I had to get out of there, so I grabbed my backpack and started to run. I could hear the creature chasing me, its growls echoing through the woods. I ran until I couldn't run anymore, finally collapsing in exhaustion. As I caught my breath, I looked up and saw the creature standing a few feet away from me. I could see its breath in the chilly night air, and I knew it was real. It was a skinwalker, a creature of Native American legend that can take on the form of any animal it desires. I don't know how I survived that night, but somehow I managed to scare the skinwalker away with a flare gun I had in my backpack. I spent the rest of the night huddled in my tent, listening to the sound of the creature pacing around my campsite. The next morning, I packed up my things and left the woods as quickly as possible. I never spoke of the experience to anyone, afraid they wouldn't believe me. But I know what I saw that night, and I'll never forget it. I had always heard stories about skinwalkers and wendigos growing up, but I never believed in them. They were just old tales meant to scare kids around a campfire, or so I thought. That all changed when I went on a camping trip with my friends last summer. We were deep in the woods, miles away from civilization. The first few nights were uneventful, but on the third night, things took a turn for the worse. I was the first one to wake up. I heard rustling outside our tent and assumed it was just an animal. But then I heard footsteps. Heavy footsteps that sounded like they belonged to something much larger than a deer or a bear. I tried to wake my friends up quietly, but they were sound asleep. That's when I heard it. A low growl, coming from right outside our tent. My heart started pounding in my chest, and I felt like I couldn't breathe. I peeked through the tent flap, and what I saw still haunts me to this day. It was a creature unlike anything I had ever seen before. It had the body of a man, but its skin was covered in fur, and its eyes glowed a sickly yellow. Its arms were long and skinny, and its fingers ended in sharp claws. I knew what it was immediately. A skinwalker. Or maybe a wendigo. I didn't know the difference, and honestly, I didn't care. All I knew was that we needed to get out of there, and fast. I shook my friends awake, and they groggily asked me what was going on. I didn't have time to explain, so I just told them to grab their things and follow me. We ran through the woods, not knowing where we were going or what we were running from. All I could hear was the sound of our footsteps and the creature's growls echoing through the trees. Finally, after what felt like hours, we stumbled upon a small cabin. It was old and run down, but it was better than nothing. We huddled inside, locking the door and barricading it with whatever we could find. The rest of the night was a blur. We took turns keeping watch, but nothing else happened. When the sun rose, we packed up our things and left the woods as quickly as we could. I still don't know what we saw that night. Was it a skinwalker? A wendigo? Or something else entirely? All I know is that I'll never go camping again without a healthy dose of skepticism and a whole lot of caution. I remember it like it was yesterday, even though it's been years since that fateful night. I was camping alone in the deep woods of northern Michigan, trying to get away from the stresses of everyday life. Little did I know, I was about to encounter something far more stressful than anything I'd ever experienced before. It was late at night, and I was sitting by my campfire, trying to stay warm. That's when I heard it, a faint rustling sound coming from the bushes nearby. At first, I thought it might be a deer or some other harmless creature. But as the rustling grew louder, my heart began to race. That's when I saw it, a figure standing just beyond the light of my campfire. It was humanoid in shape, but its skin was dark and mottled, like it had been stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes were glowing, and its teeth were bared in a menacing snarl. I was frozen in terror, unable to move or speak. The figure began to move closer, step by step, until it was just a few feet away from me. I could smell its putrid breath, and I knew in that moment that I was face to face with a skinwalker. I tried to remember everything I'd ever read or heard about skinwalkers, but my mind was a blank. All I could think about was how I was going to die out here, alone in the woods. But then, something strange happened. The skinwalker suddenly turned and fled back into the darkness. I was confused and relieved all at once. But my relief was short-lived, because that's when I heard another sound, a low growling noise that seemed to come from all around me. I knew what it was before I even saw it, a Wendigo. I had heard stories about these creatures before, and I knew that they were even more dangerous than skinwalkers. I was trapped, with nowhere to run and no way to defend myself. But just as I thought my fate was sealed, the growling stopped. I waited for what felt like hours, but the Wendigo never appeared. In the end, I was able to make it through the night unscathed. I don't know why those creatures spared me that night. Maybe they sensed that I wasn't a threat to them, or maybe it was just luck. But I do know that I'll never forget that experience, and I'll never go camping alone again. I want to share with you a terrifying experience that happened to me a few years ago. I was camping in the woods with a few friends, and we were having a great time enjoying nature and all its wonders. But one night, everything changed. We were sitting around the campfire, telling stories and roasting marshmallows when we heard something moving in the woods. It was a strange sound, like something big was walking on two legs. At first, we thought it might be a bear, but then we saw it. There, standing in the shadows, was a creature like nothing I've ever seen before. It was tall, almost 7 feet tall, and had long arms that hung down to its knees. Its eyes glowed a bright red, and its skin was dark and leathery. It was a skinwalker. We all froze in terror as the skinwalker slowly walked towards us, its eyes fixed on us the whole time. It let out a low growl, and we could hear its breath coming in short, ragged gasps. We knew we were in trouble. My friend, who was the most experienced camper among us, quickly told us to stay calm and not to make any sudden movements. He grabbed his hunting knife and slowly stood up, keeping his eyes fixed on the skinwalker. The skinwalker stopped in its tracks, and for a moment, it seemed like it was sizing up my friend. Then, it let out a blood-curdling scream and charged towards him. My friend was quick, though. He dodged the skinwalker's attack and plunged his hunting knife into its side. The skinwalker let out a horrible howl and stumbled back into the woods, disappearing into the darkness. We were all shaken up by the encounter, but we knew we had to leave the area immediately. We packed up our things and left the campsite, making sure to keep an eye out for any more signs of the skinwalker. To this day, I still can't believe what we saw. But I know for sure that skinwalkers are real, and they are not to be taken lightly. If you ever hear something strange in the woods at night, be sure to stay calm and stay safe. You never know what might be out there, waiting for you. I'm a forest ranger in a remote part of the country. I've heard all sorts of stories about the supernatural and the paranormal, but I've always been a skeptic. That is, until one night when I encountered something that still haunts me to this day. It was a dark and stormy night, and I was on patrol in the woods. I was driving slowly, scanning the area with my headlights, when I saw something move in the trees. At first, I thought it was just an animal, but as I got closer, I realized it was something else entirely. It was a figure that was half man, half animal, and it was running on two legs. Its fur was matted and dirty, and its eyes glowed in the darkness. I couldn't believe what I was seeing, but I knew I had to investigate. I got out of my truck and started walking towards the creature. As I got closer, I could feel my heart racing and my palms sweating. The creature stopped and turned towards me, and I could see that it was a skinwalker. I had heard stories about skinwalkers before, but I never believed they were real. Now, standing just a few feet away from one, I knew that they were all too real. The skinwalker let out a guttural growl and started moving towards me. I backed away slowly, trying not to make any sudden movements. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, and I knew I had to act fast. I pulled out my gun and aimed it at the skinwalker, hoping to scare it off. But it didn't seem to be intimidated. It kept coming towards me, its eyes fixed on me. Just when I thought all was lost, I heard a loud howl in the distance. The skinwalker turned and ran off into the woods, disappearing into the darkness. I never saw the skinwalker again, but the memory of that night still haunts me. I know now that there are things in this world that we can't explain, and I'll never forget the terror I felt when I encountered one of them. I never believed in supernatural creatures until the night I encountered a skinwalker. It was a chilly evening in the middle of the winter. I was driving back home after a long day of work, and I had to take a detour through the woods because of road work. The woods were dark and quiet, and I could barely see the road ahead. Suddenly, I heard a loud howling noise that echoed throughout the woods. At first, I thought it was just a wolf, but the howling grew louder and more sinister. I started to feel uneasy and afraid. As I continued to drive, I saw something moving in the shadows. It was a creature, unlike anything I had ever seen before. It was tall and skinny, with matted fur and glowing eyes. Its face was twisted into a grotesque snarl, and its long arms dangled at its side. It was a skinwalker, and it was watching me. I froze in terror, not sure what to do. The skinwalker started to move towards me, slowly at first, but then it began to run. I floored the gas pedal, trying to escape, but the creature was too fast. It was keeping pace with my car, running on all fours, its eyes fixed on me. I could feel its breath on my neck, and I knew that it was going to attack me. Suddenly, I remembered something my grandfather had told me. He had grown up on a reservation, and he had warned me about skinwalkers. He had said that the only way to defeat them was to call them by their true name. I took a deep breath and shouted, "Yinald Loshii." The skinwalker stopped in its tracks and let out a bone-chilling howl. It looked at me for a moment, and then it vanished into the woods. I sat there in my car, shaking and in shock. I had encountered a skinwalker, and I had survived. From that day on, I never drove through the woods at night, and I never forgot the name of the creature that had nearly taken my life. I remember it like it was yesterday, the night I encountered something truly terrifying in the woods. I was out camping alone, deep in the heart of the forest, enjoying the peace and quiet of nature. As the sun began to set, I decided to start a small campfire and settle in for the night. But as I lay in my tent, I heard something strange. It sounded like footsteps outside, but they were too heavy to be an animal. My heart began to race as I slowly unzipped the tent door and peeked out. That's when I saw it. A tall, thin figure standing just beyond the light of my campfire. Its eyes glowed a piercing yellow, and its long, bony fingers reached out towards me. I was frozen with fear, unable to move or even scream. The creature took a step closer, and that's when I finally got a good look at it. It had the body of a man, but its skin was gray and mottled like tree bark. Its face was twisted into a snarling expression, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth. I knew then that I was facing either a skinwalker or a wendigo. The legends and stories flooded my mind, and I felt a chill run down my spine. For what felt like hours, I remained frozen, staring into those glowing eyes. But eventually, the creature turned and disappeared into the darkness of the forest. I never saw it again, but the memory of that encounter has haunted me ever since. I don't know what it wanted, or why it chose to reveal itself to me that night. All I know is that I'll never forget the terror I felt in its presence, and I'll always be wary of the things that lurk in the darkness. I never believed in the supernatural until I experienced something that I couldn't explain. It was the summer of 2019, and I decided to take a camping trip to the remote forests of northern Michigan. I had heard rumors of strange creatures lurking in the woods, but I brushed them off as just silly stories. On the second night of my trip, I heard a sound that sent shivers down my spine. It was a low growl, deep and guttural. I thought it was just a bear or some other wild animal, so I stayed in my tent and tried to ignore it. But the growling persisted, and soon I could hear footsteps circling my tent. I knew I was in trouble when I heard a voice that sounded inhuman, whisper my name. "Don't be afraid," the voice said, "I just want to talk to you." I was paralyzed with fear. I knew that there was no one else around for miles, and yet I could hear this voice so clearly. Suddenly, my tent was ripped open, and I saw something that I will never forget. Standing in front of me was a creature that looked like a mix between a wolf and a human. Its eyes were glowing red, and its teeth were sharp and pointed. It had a pungent odor that made me gag, and I could see its muscles rippling under its skin. I was face to face with a skinwalker, a creature that I had only heard about in legends. It spoke to me in a voice that was both menacing and persuasive, trying to convince me to follow it into the woods. I knew that if I did, I would never come back. But I didn't let fear take over. I grabbed a nearby stick and started to hit the skinwalker as hard as I could. It howled in pain and retreated back into the woods, disappearing into the darkness. I quickly packed up my tent and fled the campsite, driving as fast as I could until I reached the nearest town. I reported the incident to the local authorities, but they didn't believe me. They just chalked it up to my imagination running wild. But I know what I saw that night, and I will never forget the feeling of terror that washed over me. From that moment on, I have a newfound respect for the legends of skinwalkers and other creatures that roam the forests. I know now that sometimes, the things that go bump in the night are all too real. I remember the night I saw the skinwalker like it was yesterday. It was a cold, dark night, and I was driving back from a camping trip in the mountains. I was exhausted and just wanted to get home to my warm bed. But as I drove down the lonely mountain road, something caught my eye in the darkness. At first, I thought it was just a deer or some other animal. But as I got closer, I realized it was something much more sinister. It was a figure that was walking on two legs, but it wasn't human. Its skin was dark and leathery, and its eyes glowed in the darkness. I tried to speed up and get away, but it seemed like the creature was following me. The more I drove, the closer it got. And then, it started to change. Its body twisted and contorted, and soon it was a different creature entirely. It was a wendigo, with long, sharp teeth and claws that glinted in the moonlight. It let out a blood-curdling scream that made my hair stand on end. I was terrified, but I knew I had to keep driving. I couldn't let it catch me. I sped up and drove as fast as I could, but the Wendigo was still there, following me, chasing me. It felt like it was right behind me, breathing down my neck. But then, suddenly, it stopped. It just disappeared into the darkness, and I was left alone on the road. I was shaking with fear and adrenaline, but I knew I had survived. When I got home, I tried to tell my friends and family what had happened, but no one believed me. They thought I was just tired and hallucinating. But I know what I saw, and I'll never forget it. The Skinwalker and Wendigo are out there, and I'll never drive down that road again. I've never been a big believer in the supernatural, but after what I experienced last summer, I'm not so sure anymore. I was out camping in the deep woods with a few friends, enjoying a weekend away from the hustle and bustle of city life. We had all settled down for the night, our campfire casting eerie shadows on the trees around us. It wasn't long before I drifted off to sleep, but I was soon jolted awake by a sound that made my blood run cold. It was a low, guttural growl that seemed to be coming from right outside our campsite. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest, and strained my eyes to see what was making the noise. That's when I saw it, a figure moving in the shadows just beyond the firelight. At first, I thought it might be a bear, but as it stepped closer into the light, I could see that it was something much worse. The creature was tall and thin, with skin that looked like it had been stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes were deep set and glowing with a sickly green light, and its mouth hung open in a silent snarl. I knew right away that I was looking at a skinwalker or a Wendigo, the stuff of horror stories and nightmares. I was frozen with fear, unable to move or even scream for help. The creature seemed to sense my fear and turned its gaze on me, taking a step closer. I could feel its hot breath on my face as it leaned in, its eyes boring into mine. Just when I thought it was all over, something unexpected happened. The creature suddenly recoiled, as if it had been burned, and backed away from our campsite. I could see it moving back into the shadows, disappearing from sight. I don't know what saved me that night, whether it was luck, divine intervention, or something else entirely. All I know is that I'm never going camping in the woods again. And if I ever hear that bone-chilling growl again, I'll be running for my life as fast as I can. I never believed in the supernatural until the night I saw a skinwalker. I was out camping alone in the woods, enjoying the solitude and the quiet. It was late at night, and I was sitting by my campfire, roasting marshmallows and listening to the crickets chirping in the distance. That's when I heard it, a low growl coming from the darkness beyond my campfire. I froze, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I tried to tell myself that it was just an animal, but there was something about the sound that was different. It was almost human-like, and it filled me with a sense of dread. I slowly stood up, keeping my eyes fixed on the darkness. That's when I saw it, a figure emerging from the shadows. At first, I thought it was just a person, but as it got closer, I realized that something was off. Its skin was dark and scaly, and its eyes glowed like hot coals. It was a skinwalker, a creature from Native American mythology that can take the form of any animal it chooses. I tried to back away, but my feet were rooted to the spot. The skinwalker moved closer, its growls turning into a high-pitched screech that filled my ears. I thought I was going to die, but then something strange happened. The creature's form started to shift, and it began to shrink down until it was no larger than a small animal. It turned and ran off into the darkness, disappearing from sight. I spent the rest of the night huddled in my tent, too afraid to move. When the sun finally rose, I packed up my camp and hiked out of the woods as fast as I could. I never went camping alone again, and I never forgot the fear that I felt that night. To this day, I'm not sure if what I saw was real or just a figment of my imagination. But whenever I'm alone in the woods at night, I can't help but feel like something is watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. I grew up in a small town in the woods of northern Michigan, where legends of the supernatural were whispered about in hushed tones around campfires and in dimly lit bars. I never really believed in any of it, though. To me, stories of skinwalkers and wendigos were just that, stories. That all changed one summer evening when I was out hiking alone in the woods. I had always loved the quiet solitude of the forest, and often went on long walks to clear my head and take in the beauty of nature. But on this particular day, something felt off. As I walked deeper into the woods, the air grew thick with an unsettling tension. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made me jump. I tried to brush it off, telling myself that I was just being paranoid, but the feeling wouldn't go away. Then, I saw it. At first, it was just a glimpse out of the corner of my eye, a flash of movement, too fast to be an animal. But then I turned to look directly at it, and saw what could only be described as a monster. It was tall and thin, with bony limbs and sharp claws that glinted in the fading sunlight. Its skin was mottled and patchy, like it had been stitched together from different animals. But what really made my blood run cold was its eyes, glowing orbs of yellow, like two suns burning in the darkness. I froze, unsure of what to do. Everything I had ever heard about skinwalkers and wendigos flooded my mind, and I knew that I was in grave danger. But before I could even think about running, the creature spoke. Its voice was a low, guttural growl that made my bones vibrate with fear. It spoke in a language I didn't understand, but I could tell that it was angry. It took a step forward, and I could feel the heat of its breath on my face. I was sure that I was going to die. But then, something strange happened. The creature's eyes flickered, and its body began to shrink and contort. In a matter of seconds, it had transformed into a deer, a normal, ordinary deer, like the ones I had seen a million times before. I stumbled backwards, my heart pounding in my chest. Had I imagined the whole thing? Had I just seen a deer and let my imagination run wild? But then, as I turned to leave, I heard the creature's voice in my head. It was a warning, a promise, that if I ever told anyone about what I had seen, I would suffer a fate worse than death. I never did tell anyone about that encounter, until now. And while part of me still thinks that it was all just a hallucination, I know deep down that I saw something truly terrifying that day. Something that I never want to see again. I've always been fascinated by the supernatural, but I never thought I'd actually encounter something so terrifying myself. It all started when my friends and I decided to go camping in the woods for the weekend. We arrived at the campsite and set up our tents, but something about the atmosphere just felt off. It was eerily quiet, and the birds had stopped chirping. As the sun began to set, we started a campfire and sat around telling ghost stories. I thought it was all in good fun, but little did I know that something truly terrifying was about to happen. I had heard about skinwalkers and wendigos before, but I never really believed in them. That is, until I saw one with my own eyes. It was around midnight when I heard rustling outside of my tent. I figured it was just an animal, so I tried to ignore it and go back to sleep. But then I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was a low growling sound, almost like a warning. I couldn't see anything outside, so I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped my tent. That's when I saw it. Standing in front of me was a creature unlike anything I had ever seen. Its eyes glowed red in the darkness, and its skin was stretched tight over its bones. I couldn't tell if it was a skinwalker or a Wendigo, but I knew that it was not human. I tried to back away, but the creature just stood there, staring at me with those glowing red eyes. I was paralyzed with fear, not sure if I should run or stay put. But then, as if it had lost interest in me, the creature turned around and disappeared into the woods. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I just sat in my tent, clutching my flashlight and waiting for the sun to rise. When my friends woke up the next morning, I tried to tell them what had happened, but they just laughed it off. I never went camping in those woods again. In fact, I try to avoid the wilderness altogether now. I still don't know what that creature was, but I do know that it was something not of this world. And I hope to never encounter it again. I'm not sure if what I saw that night was real or just my mind playing tricks on me, but I can still feel the fear that gripped me when I saw it. It was a few years ago, but the memory is still fresh in my mind. I was on a camping trip with some friends in the mountains. We had found a secluded spot near a small stream, and we were enjoying the peace and quiet of nature. We had set up our tents and started a fire, and we were just sitting around, chatting and drinking. As the night grew darker, we decided to turn in for the night. I crawled into my tent, feeling tired and happy. I closed my eyes and started to drift off to sleep. That's when I heard it. It was a low, guttural growl, and it sounded like it was coming from just outside my tent. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to tell myself it was just a bear, but something about the sound made me think it was something else. I sat up in my sleeping bag, listening intently. The growling continued, and I could hear something moving around outside. It sounded like it was circling my tent. That's when I saw it. It was a figure, standing just outside my tent. It was tall and thin, with long arms that reached down to its knees. It was covered in matted hair, and its eyes glowed in the darkness. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I just sat there, staring at the thing outside my tent. It seemed to be staring back at me, its glowing eyes fixed on mine. Then it started to move. It circled my tent, its long arms reaching out to touch the fabric. It growled again, and I could hear the sound of its breath, ragged and heavy. I don't know how long it lasted, but eventually, the thing moved away from my tent and disappeared into the darkness. I sat there, shaking and sweating, until the sun came up. I told my friends about what I had seen, but they didn't believe me. They said it was just my imagination, or maybe a bear. But I know what I saw, and I know it was something else. To this day, I'm not sure if it was a skinwalker or a Wendigo or something else entirely. But I know one thing for sure: I never want to experience anything like that again. I've always been a fan of the outdoors. Hiking, camping, and exploring new trails have been a passion of mine since I was a child. However, my most recent camping trip in the dense forests of northern Canada was an experience I'll never forget. I had been hiking for hours when I found a good spot to set up camp. The sun was setting, and I knew I had to act quickly to prepare for the night. I started a fire, pitched my tent, and cooked some dinner. As I was cleaning up, I heard a strange noise in the distance. At first, I thought it was just an animal, but the sound was too human-like. It was a mix of moaning and growling, and it made my skin crawl. I tried to ignore it, but it kept getting closer and louder. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside my tent to investigate. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a person, but it was too thin, too tall, and too pale. Its eyes were glowing, and its limbs seemed to be elongated. It was a skinwalker, or at least that's what I thought it was. I froze in fear, and it started to walk towards me slowly. I knew I had to act quickly, so I grabbed my bear spray and pointed it at the creature. It didn't seem to be affected by it, and it kept getting closer. I was panicking, and I felt like I was going to die. That's when I remembered something I had read about skinwalkers. They can be defeated by speaking their true name. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and yelled out the name of the person I suspected the creature had been before it turned into a skinwalker. Suddenly, the creature stopped in its tracks. It let out a blood-curdling scream, and it disappeared into the woods. I was trembling, and I didn't sleep a wink that night. The next morning, I packed my things and left the campsite as quickly as possible. I didn't want to risk encountering the skinwalker again. Even though I made it out alive, the experience still haunts me to this day. From that moment on, I always make sure to research the folklore and legends of the areas I plan to visit. I don't want to take any chances, and I certainly don't want to have another encounter with a skinwalker or a Wendigo. I've always been fascinated by the supernatural and the unexplained. But that all changed after a night that I'll never forget. It was a cold winter evening, and I was driving home from a friend's house. I was on a desolate road, surrounded by nothing but dense forest. It was so quiet that I could hear the sound of my own breath. Suddenly, I saw something move in the trees to my left. At first, I thought it was a deer, but as I got closer, I realized it was something far more terrifying. It was a creature unlike anything I had ever seen before. It had the body of a man, but its face was twisted and distorted, like it was in constant agony. Its eyes were sunken and glowing, and its skin was mottled and gray. As I drove past it, the creature locked eyes with me. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized that this was not a normal animal. This was something far more sinister. I knew that I had to get away as quickly as possible. I pressed down on the accelerator, but the creature kept pace with me. It was almost like it was playing with me, taunting me. I could hear its ragged breathing and the sound of its claws scraping against the pavement. Just when I thought I was going to be caught, I saw a light in the distance. It was a gas station, and I knew that I had to make it there. I put the pedal to the metal, and my car roared towards the light. When I finally reached the gas station, I leaped out of my car and ran inside. I was panting and sweating, but I felt relieved to be alive. I turned to look out the window, and to my horror, I saw the creature standing outside. It was watching me, waiting for me. I don't know how long I stayed in that gas station, but eventually, the creature disappeared. When I finally felt safe enough to leave, I got in my car and drove home. But even though I made it out alive, I knew that I had seen something that I would never forget. Something that I could never explain. And something that I hoped I would never encounter again. I remember the day that I saw the skinwalker like it was yesterday, even though it's been years. I was camping with my friends in the woods outside of town, just trying to get away from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. We had a great time roasting marshmallows and telling spooky stories around a campfire. But things took a turn for the worse when we decided to take a walk through the woods. We were laughing and joking, having a great time, when we heard a noise in the distance. It was a low growl, almost like an animal, but it sounded like it was coming from a human throat. We all froze in fear, wondering what could be making such a sound. That's when we saw it. A figure emerged from the darkness, slowly making its way towards us. It was tall and thin, with long, spindly arms and legs that seemed to bend in impossible ways. Its skin was a sickly gray color, and its eyes glowed red in the darkness. I could feel the fear gripping me, making it hard to breathe. My friends and I tried to run, but it was like we were stuck in molasses. The Skinwalker was getting closer and closer, and we knew that we were in serious danger. But then, something strange happened. The Skinwalker stopped in its tracks, almost as if it had sensed something. It looked up at the trees, and then it was gone, disappearing into the darkness as quickly as it had appeared. We never did figure out what had scared the Skinwalker away, but we knew that we were lucky to be alive. From that day on, I never ventured into the woods at night again. The memory of that encounter will stay with me forever, a reminder that there are things out there that we can't explain or understand. I can't believe I'm finally sharing this story, but I need to get it off my chest. It happened a few years ago, but the memory still haunts me to this day. I was on a camping trip with my friends in the middle of the woods. It was supposed to be a fun getaway, but things quickly took a turn for the worse. It was late at night, and we were all gathered around a campfire, telling spooky stories. That's when we heard it. A sound that made all of our blood run cold. It was a howl. Not a normal animal howl, but something that sounded almost human. We all froze in fear, trying to figure out what it could be. That's when we saw it. At first, we thought it was just a deer, but as it got closer, we realized it was something else entirely. It was a creature unlike anything we had ever seen before. It stood on two legs, had antlers, and its eyes glowed a bright red. We were all paralyzed with fear, not sure what to do. That's when I remembered the stories my grandmother used to tell me about skinwalkers and wendigos. I knew we had to get out of there, fast. We quickly gathered our things and started to run. But the creature was faster than we were. It was almost like it was toying with us, getting closer and closer. I could feel its breath on the back of my neck, and I knew we were in trouble. That's when we saw it. A small cabin off in the distance. It was our only hope. We ran as fast as we could, praying that we would make it there in time. We finally reached the cabin and slammed the door shut behind us. We could hear the creature outside, scratching at the door, trying to get in. We knew we were safe for now, but we had to figure out how to get out of there alive. We spent the entire night huddled in that cabin, waiting for the creature to leave. We could hear it howling outside, taunting us. But eventually, it did leave. We waited a few hours before leaving the cabin, still scared out of our minds. We never did see the creature again, but the memory of that night still haunts me. I don't know what we saw that night, but I know it wasn't human. And I never want to experience anything like that again. I never believed in supernatural creatures, until the night I encountered a skinwalker. It was a cold winter night, and I was driving home from a late shift at work. I had just passed through a deserted stretch of road, surrounded by dense forest on either side. Suddenly, I saw something move out of the corner of my eye. I slowed down to get a better look, and that's when I saw it. A creature, half human and half wolf, was running alongside my car. Its eyes were glowing a bright red, and its fur was matted and dirty. I tried to speed up, but the creature matched my pace effortlessly. It was like it was toying with me, waiting for the right moment to strike. I felt a wave of terror wash over me as I realized what I was dealing with. A skinwalker. A shape-shifting witch from Navajo folklore, capable of taking on the form of any animal it desires. I didn't know what to do. I was trapped in my car, with this creature keeping pace with me. I tried to call for help, but my phone had no signal. I was completely alone, with nowhere to run. The skinwalker continued to run alongside me for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. Finally, it veered off into the forest, disappearing from sight. I made it home safely that night, but I knew that I had come face to face with something truly terrifying. I still get chills thinking about that night, and I always keep a close eye out for any sign of that skinwalker. Because if it ever comes back, I don't think I'll be so lucky.